Welcome to Embargoed, intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I'm your host, Tim O'Toole, and with me today, as is often the case, is Melissa Burgess. This is her 47th appearance on Embargoed, so welcome back, Melissa.
Thank you, Tim. Looking forward to 50.
All right. Can't wait. And we're actually coming up on our 100th episode. We're going to have to do something interesting for that. But for now, I think we're on 94. And episode 94 is going to be CFIUS Year in Review. So it's the last of our Year in Review series. We've already talked about OFAC Year in Review and BIS Year in Review. And I think this might be our first CFIUS Year in Review episode. So why don't we get started talking about 2025, and 2025 kind of came in with a bang with President Trump taking office and issuing policy statements on a variety of things about America First. So why don't we talk first about a memorandum that the president issued with respect to America First investment policy in February of 2025.
Sounds great. I think the big takeaways are, well, one, it's a memorandum, not an executive order. So it's definitely more of a policy statement. The legal mechanisms, for the most part, remain to be implemented. I think we will see a lot of action there this year in 2026. There's already an request for information out from CFIUS Treasury on aspects of it. But the short version of the America First investment policy is we're looking to limit investors of concern, investors from countries of concern and adversaries, limit what they can do, where they can invest, how they can invest, while opening up investment to friendlier allied countries, investors from those countries. So and on top of all of that, trying to limiting the regulatory impact of any changes. So and that includes not just the regulatory impact, but the post-review impact, so mitigation. So restricting, streamlining, and opening things up at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I found most interesting about it, is it essentially starts off the administration with a policy statement that says, from the investment standpoint, prior administration, you're getting it all wrong. Basically, it's too easy for people to invest when the investments come from countries of concern, and we're going to stop that. But then once you let investors in, particularly investors who are from, countries that we're not as worried about, you're making it too hard. And it has this statement about these mitigation agreements and that they ought to be defined and short term and have, discernible goals if they come into play at all. And that, if that takes place, will be a big change from the past. So they did lay down a marker right upon coming in the door.
And you could argue both ways. Are they really saying the last administration did it wrong in terms of too easy from countries of concern? Or is it really there's been the unwritten rule or guidance, if you will, that if it's China, it's going to be hard. And now this is giving something to point to for what a CFIUS practitioner would say, like, it's going to be hard. Here's why. Here's some data. Here's some things to think about. And I think this year, 2026, we'll get a bit more of here's some things to think about.
Well, we're already seeing a
pre-mitigation,
right,
essentially.
But we're already seeing a little bit of that, at least from the stats that we're seeing from last year. It does look like we're seeing fewer mitigation agreements.
The 2024 number is definitely down. I think the 2025 CFIUS annual report will be very fascinating because it will only actually have a few months, I believe, it'll have all of 2025, but it'll have kind of the lag of last administration and cases filed prior to inauguration. And then it'll have the ramp up, if you will, of post-inauguration filings. But it will my guess, I could be very wrong, my guess is the numbers will actually be fairly light because a lot of those were going to close by December 31st type filings ran into government shutdown. So either they, if it was voluntary, they skipped filing because of that, or we'll see those numbers roll into 2026, and that 2026 will be massive, perhaps for a variety of reasons. So I do think it will be an interesting
It'll be good to
report.
look
I
at.
don't know if it will be really representative of what the America First policy is looking for. It may give us some indications, but they don't give us the month by month or even the quarter by quarter breakdown in that report, which I think would be even more fascinating in a way.
Yeah, and probably a lot more of the um, America First, trying to think of exactly the right word, but the America First slant or the America First texture will come at the end, because what we're seeing, in this, certainly in the CFIUS context and in other contexts as well, is kind of, this was the opening shot. The early 2025, the new administration comes in and they say here's what we're interested in foreign investment, here's what we're interested in export controls, but it takes a while to actually ramp up and actually put, meat on the bone of that strategy. And we're starting to see that at the end of 2025, the beginning of 2026. And so I think it will be fascinating to see kind of quarter by quarter, but also kind of what really happens this year, because I think this year is the year where they've figured out now how they're going to do this, like the strategy for accomplishing what they set out as the goal. And so let's see, what the metrics are once they start trying to put it into action.
Yeah. I think there's some other interesting themes from the year, not necessarily entirely administration driven, but also administration driven in terms of, every year we get that annual report. It gives us some insight, not a ton. Most years we get at least one prohibited transaction. And again, why they're prohibited sometimes on the face of it, it looks, shall we say, obvious. Sometimes less so. But I think an interesting theme of late 2024 into 2025 was how much discussion of CFIUS there was, largely in relation to one specific transaction, with kind of a lot of the American public discovering or being reminded that CFIUS
Rediscovering,
exists.
right? Dubai ports a while
But
back, they heard about it, and then it's been
yes,
a
yes.
while.
Um,
TikTok a little bit as well.
yeah. But even that, memories can be a bit short. Like remembering that started as a CFIUS issue, um,
Right,
and
because it had lots of,
finally got closed out as a CFIUS issue with an executive order.
and a
Um,
statute in between
yep,
as
and a
well.
statute in between. So in some ways, it felt like it was a kind of quiet year, but it's when you actually stop and look at it, it was not at all. There was a lot in the public. There were a lot of things kind of finally moving, getting closed out, perhaps in novel ways. And I think that's a common theme of CFIUS in general, of where there's a will, there's a way. And the question is whose will is strongest often with
Right,
CFIUS. Because often if you're getting to that point of a denial, it means you're not able to find the mechanism that CFIUS is comfortable with and you from the business perspective are comfortable with, or that really makes a reasonable business, that has a reasonable business case. But it'll be interesting to see whether some of the 2025 finally finding a resolution to some of these bigger, tricky transactions continues to have effects, or whether with the America First policy and the preference to not have mitigation agreements, and any mitigation agreements there are should be limited in time and scope, not forever agreements, whether that actually leads to more, not necessarily denied transactions, but more voluntarily withdrawn because the mechanisms to get a limited mitigation
Right.
could be fairly difficult. At least, and institutionally, CFIUS will probably have a hard time getting to not forever mitigation unless it gets to it, we're going to set these rules of the road, but we won't audit them or oversee them in the same way, which could be the workaround.
Well, and to your point before, that's where I was seeing the at least implicit criticism of the last administration, at least when they're talking about mitigation agreements. I got the sense that what they were saying was with countries of concern, the last administration was basically like we can have these really intense mitigation agreements and mitigate the effect of countries of concern. And at least part of what they were saying about mitigation agreements is we don't have the same philosophy. If you're from a country of concern, you're not getting a mitigation agreement. You're getting shut out, and so don't come knocking. And then, with respect to non-countries of concern, saying exactly the sorts of things that you're talking about, which is we're going to have these, very concrete, closed off mitigation agreements that say, here's our problems, address them, and then go on and operate your business, not the, open-ended, like we, as a condition of our approval, we'll get to essentially have our, nose in the tent forever running the company. Now, sometimes though, to at least pivot a little bit to one of the things that I think you were hinting at, Melissa, the U.S. Steel case shows kind of an alternate view of how the government can put its, maybe not its nose in the tent, but its hand in the cookie jar as part of the CFIUS approval process. You want to talk a little bit about U.S. Steel? Because I think it's a really helpful discussion because it is one that straddled the two administrations. So it really, starts off 2025 with the president blocking the U.S. steel purchase by Nippon Steel, and then goes from there and gets resolved in 2025 as well.
And the interesting part was that the public was really along for the ride for most of it, knew that it had been voluntarily withdrawn and refiled. I think part of that was probably strategic on the parts of the parties because they were trying to make their case to the public of why this deal made sense to them and why they thought it was good and trying to get that support. It's interesting because CFIUS will often say, we're not a political process. We're, all about national security and only national security, which can be defined in many ways,
Right.
or very broadly. But I think with this, it at least publicly, it seemed much more of a political process, and I think it was. I don't know how much it's a complete aberration, but because of the election year dynamics, absolutely became a political issue, and also had the very interesting angle of basically the labor unions almost, again, from an outside perspective, almost being a third party to the deal, and that having a lot of sway, a lot of what appeared to be an almost outside role in the transaction dynamics, the CFIUS dynamics, and some of those related considerations. Now, I'm sure there's a lot behind the scenes that did not come out in public, did not come out accurately in public, and all the rest. But it did kind of give a lot to think about in terms of some of the less common aspects of a transaction that could become a national security, maybe not becoming a national security concern, but be reviewed for potential national security risks, and then having to do, from a practitioner's perspective, having to make the case of that's not a national security risk. It may be a business risk, it may be an employment consideration, it may be all these other things, but that doesn't make it national security.
Yeah, I mean, so that is kind of an interesting question as to what is national security. We've been faced with it relatively recently in connection with the president's executive order on essentially the defense industry in the U.S. defense sector. And essentially, they're going to start making decisions in part based, or at least primarily based, on what's best for the U.S. defense industry. And so that is not traditionally the role, and I think he was talking there about export controls. That's not traditionally the role of export controls. Export controls are supposed to be kind of, you have reasons for the control, and the reasons for control usually are not, U.S. business will benefit. Like, that is not usually the reason for the control. But you can understand, even in the export controls context, why isn't that part of national security? That is, if you build a strong defense sector, why isn't that important to national security as a whole? In the same way here, like, national security can include a portion of, if we build stronger industries without foreign control, at least, that is better for the U.S. national security as a whole. And so it's not tradition. These are not interests that have traditionally come in expressly, but you certainly can make the case that maybe national security has traditionally not been defined broadly enough to include interests that relate to national security. And maybe not.
Yeah. Well, we are straying a bit into 2026, but
yes, sorry.
I do think it's an interesting aspect of that, the America First executive order that you just mentioned, because there are hints about using foreign capital, but it's not committed to only in the context of sales. So I am very intrigued. I will be very interested to see whether we have more, probably non-controlling will probably be the key, but more foreign investment from NATO allied countries in essentially U.S. manufacturing capability. CFIUS has historically looked at supply chain security for the defense sector. President Biden's executive order in, I believe it was 2022, looked at supply chain security more broadly. But taking it from, potentially moving it from are you going to shut down our U.S. supply chain to, are you actually enhancing and ensuring the stability of the U.S. supply chain and ensuring, long-term foreign customers to help the stability of that supply chain? I think that could be one of the themes that comes out of 2026 as a result of the executive order, and again, perhaps building off of the America First investment policy.
Well, and I do think that plays right into how, the U.S. Steel acquisition was ultimately resolved by CFIUS. I mean, so President Biden blocked the transaction. It was resubmitted to President Trump. Eventually, after quite a bit of discussion, President Trump approved the transaction, or CFIUS approved the transaction, with the dreaded national security agreement, so mitigation. But the mitigation was new investment of a particular amount in the U.S., commitments related to governments, which is pretty normal, the golden share held by the U.S. government, which is at least it's
not
interesting.
Not quite as common.
Not quite as common. But also domestic production and commitments. And so essentially, CFIUS was being used to ensure, the mitigation agreements were being used to ensure essentially domestic production, similar to the topics of the 2026 executive order as well. And so, we do see that resolution some of the same themes that show up in the later executive order, that showed up in the memorandum right as President Trump took office. And so, the one thing I will say is that there was a national security agreement, and it does seem to have some pretty long-lasting commitments.
Yeah.
but apart from that, it was an interesting resolution, and certainly along the lines of what President Trump said that he was going to do in the national or in the memorandum that he kicked off office.
Yep. And I think there are a couple interesting takeaways from that in terms of, if you're planning a major high-profile investment in something that's likely to be sensitive. Your game planning may need to include some off the wall ideas, shall we say?
Well, what's in it for
And
the U.S.?
yes, what's in it for the U.S. and what, again, whether it's a golden share, whether it's something else, just how far are you willing to go for this transaction? And game planning those out early. And I'm not saying the parties didn't necessarily do this, but maybe not some of the permutations that were later presented to them. But game planning that out, understanding what are your kind of points of no return, this deal will be done, understanding where you have some flexibility, understanding the business case for and against some of that, and just the actual logistics of implementation for some of that could be really important. And if you're a U.S. business considering strategic investment, thinking about the type of investment you're seeking, controlling, non-controlling, really the rationale for it, and are you doing this? Is this for you, the U.S. business, to shore yourself up, or is this we're riding off into the sunset and we don't really care as long as our paycheck comes in? That latter type might actually have a harder time depending on the industry, because if the riding off into the sunset involves the business crossing a border and moving overseas, CFIUS is probably less inclined between the America First, both the executive order and the memorandum, to say yes to that. But one other thing I wanted to mention that it was a bit of a theme of 2025, and we should start seeing it play out a lot in 2026, is outside of CFIUS, with all of the trade negotiations. A lot of those include some investment commitments, Japan being a prime example of that. So not just in the U.S. Steel case where there was specific investment commitments to the U.S. company, but much broader statements about, Japan's going to invest this much money. I believe UAE as well has a major investment commitment. Some of those could be very open-ended. Some of those could be very targeted. But it will be interesting to see how that plays out in terms of the CFIUS process, because that doesn't mean there's going to be a guarantee of approval for investments from those countries. But that will have to play, that kind of foreign policy aspect will have to play into the committee's decisions to a degree. Again, the committee's role is to review transactions for risks to national security, and if it finds a threat, to mitigate the threat. But it could be thinking much more broadly in the, well, what's the mitigation for this threat? It could start taking a broader picture, looking at the broader picture and thinking maybe not with less focus, but stepping back and saying, okay, here's a threat, but the president's goal, the administration's goal, the broader national security picture is XYZ. So maybe, again, finding some type of mitigation or non-mitigation agreement to get to a yes with some off-the-wall ideas thrown in.
Yeah, that in many ways encourage more foreign investment in the United States. I mean, that's what I see as kind of interesting about this mitigation agreement, kind of some of the other policies that are coming out of the administration, is that although, often the role of CFIUS has been to say no or to say yes, but with lots of conditions to foreign investment, there is this kind of aspect of, no, we want this foreign investment isn't enough. We want other type. If you're going to invest in X, we also want you to invest in Y and Z in the United States, because we're not just going to let you invest in X. And that's interesting. I mean, it's not clear to me that has been CFIUS's traditional role, but in some ways, maybe CFIUS was viewed too narrowly as kind of a just say no to foreign investment in the right circumstances, and now it's more of a, yeah, we'd like foreign investment just fine. This one worries us a little bit, but if you were to do this one plus a couple others, then maybe we would say yes, with a mitigation agreement, which, again, is not what they said coming in the door, but the problem is that you review these agreements or you review these proposals and you start to notice things, and the easiest way to solve those issues is to say, okay, this is what we don't like about it. If you fix that, then we'll approve it.
It would be interesting if one of the ways of avoiding mitigation agreements is a regulatory process to impose as a regulatory provision certain types of restrictions on or expectations for certain transactions. So common features of mitigation agreements are one, if you have the agreement, you're going to have a security officer. You're probably going to have some type of reporting requirement, or almost guaranteed to have some type of reporting requirement. If it's a big enough mitigation agreement, you're going to have some audit requirements, some things like that. I wouldn't be shocked if those common features eventually made it into regulations. They wouldn't apply to everybody all the time. They would only apply in the case that you're subject to, maybe they'll come up with a new term, not mitigation.
Right.
But then some of that's baked in, and then that's the regulatory expectation. And I think that could solve, not that I want to suggest more regulations, but I think that could solve a couple problems. One, the interpretive aspect of when those are negotiated on a case-by-case basis, then to a degree it's up to how the CMAs are feeling about the transaction. Sorry, the CFIUS monitoring agencies, for those who don't know. How they feel about the transaction. It could vary from case to case, and then you sit there and you look at, well, it's talking about control in our NSA, but the definition of control in the CFIUS regulations is actually much longer and more detailed. Which one does that one fill in our gaps? Things like that. So that could also solve the problem of CFIUS can only mitigate if existing laws don't provide that mitigation. Okay, regulations are not laws, but there may be an avenue there. there may be an avenue there to solve part of that problem. I could be very wrong, but it's an idea. It's an idea for 2020.
No, look, it's a good idea for 26 because I do think that the memorandum at the beginning of 2025 put its finger on what I think is probably the worst aspect of these mitigation agreements, and that is that they often don't end, or if they end way into the future. And having that sort of supervisory oversight with either an officer or the CMAs or both that goes on ad infinitum is just not a good way to run a business. I mean, it's very business unfriendly. It is one of those things where that is an issue that does, I think, need to be fixed. And one way to fix it is to impose some of these terms by regulation, so that essentially there are some common terms that apply to every purchase that mitigate any potential harms from national security, but don't involve a long-running oversight, direct oversight by the U.S. government or by some sort of U.S. government officer of these companies. I mean, then they become more like, these monitorships. So, and this administration, from what it looks like from the outside, doesn't appear to like monitorships either. And so you impose them more rarely. And when you do impose them, you have a kind of a date certain as to when they end. Because right now in the CFIUS context, you do have this oversight that can go on without an end date. And that just, that is, in my view, problematic.
Yeah. And I think there are a lot of pros and cons to the idea of having a preset mitigation menu, at least for certain categories of transactions. Again, if the preference is away from mitigation, that probably means more denials, but it also means more certainty and more structure for the transactions that can get to that mitigation point. Because it won't be, there may be case-by-case aspects still, but the common features from a mitigation agreement, those could be preset.
Well, and you can also have the interpretations of the provisions will be more uniform, so that you're not dependent upon whatever CMAs that you have to interpret unique language that doesn't appear anywhere else. It's like the same language with an agency interpreting it, as opposed to, bespoke language in every different agreement with, some subpart of the agency interpreting it in ways that are often not, consistent.
Or one other idea there is much easier, going to involve fewer pages in the Federal Register, starting with an automatic, every agreement has to be reassessed at certain intervals to force CFIUS back to the table, because for the most part, existing NSAs, unless you're trying some new follow-on transaction, you're not getting back to the drawing table, because it's really up to the CMAs to decide whether or not you get to. So even having that a bit like you have on the DCSA side, so with mitigation agreements for cleared facilities, there are those kind of set time limits within the agreement. It doesn't mean that they automatically end then. Normally you're coming back to renegotiate, rediscuss it. But if you have that 3 or 5 year period automatically, there's a bit of a precedent, yeah.
And maybe even a presumption that they sunset, so that essentially you come back, you assume that what needed to be mitigated was mitigated, but you don't automatically just walk off into the sunset. You have a reset, but you don't have this thing where you essentially have to persuade the CMAs that they should take another look at this, because there's nothing in the regs and there's nothing in the agreements that say that they have to. And I think that is potentially problematic.
Especially when the mitigation is imposed on companies that are kind of in cutting edge areas where what the operations looked like when they were in front of CFIUS and the resulting mitigation may be extremely burdensome or really not fit to purpose once the company was really up and running, or once the technology changed and you're trying to fit kind of old, outdated mitigation onto new procedures. And unless the CMAs get just really tired of it, they're probably not going to take the initiative to reopen and renegotiate because, well, they have a process already. But we shall see. We shall see what 2026 holds.
We shall see what it brings. So for the normal human beings part of this podcast, we'll segue into 2 other quick transactions. But just to set the stage, if you're not a CFIUS nerd yet, these are all foreign investments in particular U.S. companies where CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, has the ability to review these certain investments, and these were the types of investments that it can review, to determine whether or not the investment is in the national security interest of the United States, or whether or not it could be made to be within the national security interests of the United States if it was mitigated in certain ways. So essentially, the committee looks at these agreements. It can do so because you submit it to them. It can do so even if you don't submit it to them because they find out about it later. And so U.S. Steel was one that we just talked about that was reviewed through submissions and was blocked by the president, but then eventually approved with mitigation by the president. Jupiter Systems and TikTok were 2 other kind of big, high-profile 2025 CFIUS reviews that came in front of the president last year. You want to talk about either of those? Anything more to say?
Yeah. TikTok, since I think it's better known by the populace.
Right. Than ByteDance.
That was actually a 2020 case that was prohibited. So it resulted in an executive order prohibiting the transaction. And then many things ensued, including Congress trying to force the divestment of TikTok. And as pretty much everybody knows, one of the President Trump's first acts back in office was to extend the timeline for the divestment. But here it was September of this year, after multiple extensions, they finally got to a point where they had a deal. And so we had a new executive order that essentially said all the conditions have been met and it's now, it's a new joint venture. The foreign owner does still have some interest in it, but they determined it was no longer a controlling interest. Met all sorts of other requirements, some of those public, many of those not public. But what we got in September 2025 was in part an amendment of the 2020 executive order that had prohibited the transaction. So in President Trump's first term is when it was prohibited. So now, all these years later, we have the new executive order that modifies those provisions and says basically that divestment order is no longer in effect because the divestment has been completed to our satisfaction. So that's a bit different because that's not really a mitigation agreement, but in some ways it was getting there by other means.
It wasn't an agreement, but there was mitigation.
But it's again, where there's a will, there's a way. If you're willing to make a deal, any deal.
Never give up.
Yep, perseverance does pay off. So that is an interesting one, just because there was, again, so public. Again, CFIUS, for the normal people, CFIUS does not typically occur in the public. You do not typically know this much about a transaction. Generally, you only know a transaction's under review if the parties to the transaction specifically say, we are under CFIUS review for this.
Which they normally don't.
Which they normally don't. They wait till after it's finished to say, we've cleared. And often, even then, they won't say, oh, we completed CFIUS review. They'll say, we have all our regulatory approvals. They might say CFIUS review if they need to reassure people, if they're trying to keep the hill from saying, CFIUS, you need to review this. But otherwise, you might hear rumors something's under review, again, or could be under review. Again, if the hill is concerned about a transaction, they like to send letters to CFIUS and say, are you reviewing this? Have you reviewed this? But besides that, it's a private process. You only know about it in the case of a divestment, because that's when the names become, or in the case of a prohibition, because that's when the names become public.
Which is why often when it looks like there's going to be a prohibition, companies will withdraw the transactions so that the prohibition doesn't become public, the transaction doesn't become public.
And all you see is that figure in the annual report of, well, this many were withdrawn, and they chose not to go forward, which there are a few of those every year. But the Jupiter systems, I think, will be a even more interesting one to talk about in the 2026 annual review. In part because just recently, so they were proposed transaction denied earlier in 2025. Chinese acquirer, Hong Kong acquirer, the U.S. target had defense U.S. government related business. Ordered to divest, have not moved fast enough, and very, very recently, U.S. Department of Justice basically sued to enforce the divestment. So that will be a very interesting one to watch how it plays out, because that's the term that is thrown out there is an unprecedented, unusual step to basically sue to enforce it. So we could see a much more aggressive enforcement from CFIUS, but in that way, I don't think we had any CFIUS enforcement actions, announcements of fines in 2025, but it will be interesting to see how the enforcement plays out in 2026.
Right. This is a CFIUS divestment order that was not executed by the party that was ordered to divest, and so essentially there's an enforcement lawsuit that's being brought by DOJ to have the divestment order, the president's divestment order, carried out. I think part of the reason we don't see these lawsuits is that for the most part, the agencies would much prefer to resolve, and it's not just CFIUS, I mean, the agencies that we're in front of a lot, so OFAC and BIS and DDTC, they all want to do things by settlement because there's no risk. You get the settlement, it's done, and they know what's going to happen, and you know what's going to happen. And so they'd much prefer to proceed by settlement, which is why it takes them so long to go enforce these things, even when they have the president's order and the statutory authority behind it, because you just never know what will happen when you go into a court, particularly for CFIUS, where you have kind of these very valuable property interests that are at stake. And I think people could debate how much process CFIUS gives you in terms of what you're able to do with your property. And so there are these interesting issues that come up when you go to court that I think all agencies would prefer never to see the light of day, because you just don't know how a particular court's going to come out on those issues. And so I think that enforcement actions like this are rare. I suspect that the company is going to, fight very hard to try and assert its property interests, and we will see what the outcome of it is.
Yeah, but most of those, when you get to a denial that involves a divestment order, that means that it had already closed as opposed to being prospective, of course. But most of them give CFIUS the authority to give the party some extension, if not all of them. And this one, if I recall correctly, did have that authority.
I think they had a few extensions.
But it could be maybe they were trying to pull a TikTok in terms of, let's see if we can drag this out long enough and find a deal. Or maybe it really was, we're doing our thing on our timeline, and CFIUS just doesn't like that because, I guess it works both ways. If you don't want long-term mitigation, you also have to act quickly on meeting those conditions that are imposed on you, even if it's a divestment, which is the most onerous form of mitigation, perhaps.
All right. So one last thing to talk about, I think, in CFIUS, and that is CFIUS 2025, I think, real estate and changes to the real estate rules are a potential theme. Now, not a lot of them happened, but there were a lot of proposed rules. And just to set the stage on this, so CFIUS has the power to review foreign investment in real estate transactions, generally when those transactions involve critical infrastructure. So property that's near critical infrastructure, property that is critical infrastructure. But beyond that, there's not a ton of jurisdiction for CFIUS to look at foreign investment in real estate transactions. And so that has at least potentially started to change in 2025. You want to talk about how that is changing and what it is that people are thinking about having CFIUS look at more closely?
So investment in real estate has been a theme for quite a few years now, actually. A lot of it stems from a transaction a few years ago in North Dakota near the Air Force Base in Grand Forks, North Dakota. And there, if I recall correctly, it was a bunch of agricultural land, and a Chinese entity was going to come in and make a huge investment. And what came out of the process was a realization that we have a lot of bases with sensitive technology on them that are not on the list of what CFIUS currently has jurisdiction to review. So the list has a bunch of mostly military bases and some like bombing ranges. And generally, CFIUS has authority to review real estate transactions that are within either 1 mile or within 100 miles of a named base location, whatever it might be. So coming out of the Grand Forks transaction, which CFIUS determined it didn't have jurisdiction over, the deal fell through for other reasons, but CFIUS did kind of a Band-Aid rework of the list of relevant military installations, and then in the following year had a much bigger rework of sensitive locations. And some, bases are renamed. Air Force bases became Space Force bases, some things like that. So there's been minor changes, but all in all, those have been minor changes. And what hasn't changed, because it requires legislative action, is expanding jurisdiction more broadly to places that aren't within that proximity of military installation. And that's where A lot of these acts over the years have been proposed. Again, you can kind of tell by the names, the Soil Act, the Farmland Act, that we're looking at agricultural land more broadly, because CFIUS doesn't have jurisdiction over agricultural land as agricultural land. Again, it would have to be within the relevant distance of a listed base or facility right now. So a lot of these acts take similar approaches to solving the problem, but each one has its own little tweaks. Some focus on investments by countries of concern, kind of a usual suspect list in terms of China, the comprehensively sanctioned countries, Maduro regime, and Russia. Again, variations on a theme between all of them. Some would have actually had a prohibition. So right now, CFIUS doesn't have any, like, this type of transaction is automatically prohibited, but some of the proposals would have had automatic prohibitions, like just these investments from these countries of concern or these actors of concern absolutely prohibited. So that would be a big change if we got that. But yeah, I think the theme is we had a lot of proposals introduced. None of them really made it. What's also happening on kind of as a counterpart to this is U.S. Department of Agriculture has had a statutory mandate to track some of these investments for a while, and that was one of those mandates that maybe was not prioritized. And now they're doing much more to prioritize that, enforce it, require the reporting that's required. But I won't be shocked if we do see some movement on that again in 2026, either just on its own or as part of implementing the America First memorandum, because that does push for some additional movement on greenfield investment, brownfield potentially, and other areas that have been kind of floating out there as on the edges, shall we say, of CFIUS jurisdiction.
So look for movement in 2026 on the Soil Act, the Farmland Act, the Protect Act, or one of those coming soon.
Yeah, some other variation on that theme.
To a legislative hearing near you. All right. So I think that's a pretty good roundup of CFIUS 2025. There is this thing that can be referred to as sometimes is referred to as reverse CFIUS. That is, so CFIUS is money coming into the United States from foreign investors. There is something that there were some regulations in 2024, the Outbound Investment regulations, that dealt with money going out of the United States, so investments by U.S. persons into certain quote-unquote countries of concern, which is essentially China, and we're targeting three types of investments basically. You had quantum computing, you had semiconductors, and you had artificial intelligence, which is some subset of quantum of both of the two, and certainly semiconductors. So that was essentially, we had those at the end of 2024. But we did want to kind of pause on these outbound investment rules for 2025 because there were a few significant things that happened. And just to follow up on outbound investment, so those rules essentially for certain investments from countries of concern would trigger notification requirements. That's normally what was triggered. And then some sorts of those investments became prohibited once the outbound investment rules took place. So with that, I'll turn it over to you to talk about 2025 reverse CFIUS outbound investment.
So the two big changes are those rules actually going into effect, everyone having to start complying with them. And then near the end of the year, the passage of the Coins Act as part of the NDAA. So the Coins Act is the Comprehensive Outbound Investment National Security Act, and it essentially provides additional and kind of superseding statutory authority for the existing outbound investment program. It's no longer just an IEPA program, but it still has IEPA elements. And that act in 2026, we will see application or massaging of the existing regulations to fit some of the changes introduced in the act. So the act has kind of three main elements. One is a sanctions authority. One is tied to a sanctions authority again, involving the CMIC sanctions program, so the non-SDN program that currently restricts U.S. persons from buying and selling shares in certain publicly traded entities in China. And then the third, the kind of the meat portion, if you will, of the Coins Act is the language about the outbound investment program. It expands that program in a few ways beyond just China. So we have, again, the usual suspect countries are covered by it, including the Maduro regime again and Russia. And then it expands the covered technologies a bit. So one of the big additions, the biggest addition is adding hypersonics into that set of restrictions. A few other changes that are very, very in the weeds of certain transactions that will and won't be covered, will and won't be prohibited, will and won't require reporting. It also, the regulations already have some VSD provisions, but it mandates some voluntary self-disclosure provisions, and a few other aspects to kind of round out the program, and now Treasury has to go back to the drawing board to implement those, figure out where it needs to massage and fit the regulations to the act. So more to come in that. Again, it's both a very broad and very narrow set of regulations because unlike CFIUS, it only targets certain countries, certain investments, certain technologies, and it doesn't have the same broad real estate, non-controlling investments and controlling investments that can give CFIUS jurisdiction over a lot of transactions. But it does have very tricky aspects in terms of reaching to transactions that don't have a, shall we say, immediate U.S. nexus in terms of actions by subsidiaries and affiliates or involving subsidiaries and affiliates. There can be kind of a long arm that will hook some transactions in third countries.
On both sides, right? So it reaches to subsidiaries of Chinese-owned companies, and then it also reaches to subsidiaries of U.S.-owned companies. And so you can essentially have a Norway to France transaction that is covered by the outbound investment rules because you've got a U.S. sub on one side and a Chinese sub on the other. And that is, at least for me, I've found the trickiest part of these rules is kind of spotting that this is a transaction that's going to be covered by the outbound investment rules. But if you are in the AI space, if you're in the semiconductor space, if you're in the quantum computing space, and you're a U.S. company, you should be thinking about these rules. All right. Anything else from 2025 in the CFIUS, reverse CFIUS field that we should have covered but did not?
No, I think we got the key points. Again, I think the themes are really, or one of the themes is really where there's a will, there's a way. All right, if you really want that deal, you just have to be ready to have a variation on the theme of that deal.
Keep going.
If it's a sensitive transaction.
All right, then we will leave it there as the last word. Melissa, thanks for coming back on Embargo.
Of course.
All right, well, we'll see you next time, if not sooner. And for those listeners, thanks for listening, everybody, and stay CFIUS compliant.
Produced by Heartcast Media.